Architectural Outcast.
Welcome to the Architectural Outcast. I'm Randy. We've finally reached the last city to be critiqued in Oblivion, Coral. If y'all missed my previous videos critiquing the architecture of Oblivion, here's a playlist. At this point, there's several hours of commentary. There is one more city besides Coral, Kavach. Now, I don't want to brag or anything, but I'm known as the hero of Kavach for what I did to try to help save the city because somebody decided to burn the city to the ground. Between you and me, if you look into it, you'll realize Maroon's Dagon's real estate portfolio was overextended in Kavach. So, Mrs. O'Leary's cow managed to kick over a bucket, which accidentally released a Deidre invasion that just so happened to burn the city down, including every single one of Maroon's Dagon's properties. Allegedly. Last thing I'd want is to be sued by a Deidre lord. Coral's an interesting mix. It's a microcosm of all that is good and bad about Oblivion's world building. Coral is to the west of Imperial City, and if you follow the main quest, it's one of the first cities you'll encounter in the game because you'll be sent to Waynon Priory, which is right outside Coral's main gate. Right off the bat, Coral has a problem. It has no reason to exist. Coral doesn't sit on the coast or a river, so it can't be a port city. The city's isolated from the rest of Cyrodiil, with roads only leading to Imperial City and Bruma. If there was a road connecting Coral to Anvil, then the city would be on a key trade route that runs goods coming in through the port of Anvil up into Skyrim. Without the road to Anvil, the road connecting Coral to Bruma makes no sense. The only reason why it exists is it makes a quest line a little easier, which is not a legitimate reason to put a road halfway across your map. As shown, the only reason Coral could exist is to provide something, food, raw materials, timber, minerals, something to Imperial City. When we get to Coral, we find it's in the mountains surrounded by wilderness. It ain't providing food, or anything else for that matter. So we come back to the question, why does the city exist in the first place? Now, I wasn't in the room when this map was made, but it looks like Bethesda made a common fantasy map mistake. Whenever you look at a map of our world, you'll notice that cities appear to be relatively evenly spaced across the map. This will cause a lot of fantasy world builders to make the same mistake. They will first place their most important city at some key geographic point, and then they'll place cities on the coast because you need ports after all. And then they will sprinkle cities evenly placed everywhere else. This reveals a complete lack of understanding as to why in our world, cities are relatively evenly spaced across the landscape. Historically, human settlements have been separated by 1 day's journey. This means that a farm, a mine, whatever, at most is half a day's journey from the nearest settlement, which also means you can go into that settlement, do your business, and come back home all in 1 day. The reason why a settlement would be placed on its specific site could vary. Crossroads, ford in the river, on the coast, military, social, cultural, religious significance. And then the history of that specific site would determine if it remained a village or became a major city. Human needs, geography, built environment, and history all come together to give a city a reason to exist, all of which Coral has none of. One of the things that Oblivion is really good at is making every single city feel unique, feel like it has its own culture and history that led to its own unique built environment. Bethesda puts in the hard work, and they do a good job creating unique cities, and then they actively undermine all of that hard work with their stables. Their copy and paste stables, complete with all the same mistakes. Like the same old hinges on the wrong side of the door.
Wah, wah, wah.
With time constraints and the limitations of the technology at the time, like how much data you could put on a game disk, it would make sense that you'd want to reuse assets as much as possible. If your goal is to create a unique city, the last thing you want to do is use the same building in a prominent place, like a stable outside the front gate, that will be the player's first impression. Every time a player encounters another identical stable, it breaks immersion. The game is telling them, this isn't real. What's frustrating is that this stable that we find all over Cyrodiil belongs in Coral. In my previous video on Cheydinhal, I talked about how this stable, its materiality, and its form fits that environment. At Coral, not only does the stable's materiality and form match its environment, its architecture matches the architecture of the city as well. You make your way into Coral, and you find yourself on the wrong side of the tracks, in poor people part of town, and oh no, it's the same building! If this building was only found around Coral, it wouldn't be that big a deal. It matches the other buildings in town. Post and beam structure, rock half walls, boards on the upper, wood shingles. It doesn't just match the poor people's houses, because the poor people's houses are just shabbier versions of all the other houses in town. The main gate into Coral is similar to what we saw at Bruma. It's a bastion. This is a very well defended gate. Similar to my critique of Bruma's main gate, this little bastion looks believable. It looks like what we expect a main gate to look like. And that takes into account they didn't put in a second gate, but there are the grooves where the gate would go. The gate is implied, and we, the player, can fill in the gaps with our imagination. One quick criticism: that arch is too high. The section of wall above it is too narrow, too thin, too weak, too easy to damage, and there's not enough room to put in a portcullis. Having the outer gate so tall doesn't serve any purpose outside of aesthetics, because the secondary gate is way shorter. That bastion causes a couple of problems though. First off, Anvil, arguably one of the most important cities in all of Cyrodiil, it's a port city after all, it doesn't have a bastion defending its main gate. But Coral, a city that we still don't know why it exists in the first place, but yet it's so important, it needs a bastion to guard its front gate. That brings us to our second issue. A defense is only as strong as its weakest point. And why would an army attack this bastion when they could march around to the back gate, which isn't as heavily defended? If y'all like what I'm doing here on the Architectural Outcast, consider liking the videos and subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate it, and it helps out more than you realize, especially with all the changes going on here on YouTube lately. Similar to Cheydinhal, Coral has the feel of being a small provincial city, where Cheydinhal's architecture is playful and whimsical with all sorts of decorative elements just because they can. Coral's architecture, on the other hand, is much more pragmatic and almost fortress-like. There's decoration, but it's been used in a much more restrained manner. On a bit of a side note, a lot of the houses in Oblivion, particularly here in Coral, have a form that is very similar to houses you find all over suburban America. This isn't an accident, because a lot of the buildings that we use today, their form, their style, have their origins in building forms and styles that were in common use during the Middle Ages. That's why so many fantasy worlds are placed in a European medieval setting. We recognize the building forms, intuitively know what they're supposed to be used for, but they're different enough to feel exotic. The stone houses in the fancy part of town are well done. There's no major issue with the building structures. They look believable. They look like they would actually hold up the buildings. They follow the pattern of historic fortified buildings. Ground floors are heavy and solid. The higher up you go, the lighter the materials and the more windows. The post and beam buildings have a lot of the same stylistic elements that are seen in the stone buildings. You have overhanging second floors, the same gabled roofs with wood shingles, and similar windows. Some of the post and beam buildings are believable. Their structures look right. And then there are other buildings. Now, I got to give it to Bethesda. When they decide to make a mistake, they stick with it. Some of these things I've been talking about going all the way back to my critique of Skingrad. With this building, the post and beam structure is just fine. Where we start running into silliness is the rock wall infill on the lower level. If you're going to have a rock walled lower level, what you should do is then have the post and beam upper floors sitting on top of that rock wall. What you would gain is a very strong rock wall, and you would lift your wood structure out of the muck and mire, away from moisture and insects. With some of these buildings, you have the silliness taken to another level, where you have these rock wall infill sections sitting on top of a wood beam. You better hope that one, that wood beam is strong enough to hold up all that weight, and two, that wood beam never rots, because you say goodbye to your building. And then there are buildings that whoever designed them clearly doesn't have a clue about structures. This building has two structures, two incomplete structures, that as shown is not capable of standing. The building's first structure is post and beam. Now that in of itself isn't an issue because most of Oblivion's architecture is based upon post and beam structures. The problem with this particular post and beam structure, it's missing its most important elements, the corner posts. The second structure is the stone walls, but those walls are divided up by all those beams, which means the stone walls aren't structural. You need the wood corner post to hold those stone sections in place. And to make matters worse, what's separating the first floor from the second floor is a wood beam. You better hope that beam can hold all the weight of those stones, which, by the way, it can't. There's no excuse for this, because right next door, we have a properly designed stone-walled building. And just across the street is a properly designed post and beam structure. Well, mostly, because on the back wall, the upper floor could use a few more posts. Similar to Chadenhall, Coral also has an open, unused section to the city, further adding to the feel of a young provincial city still growing. Chadenhall's open spaces are wild and rugged, as if the wilderness is trying to invade the city, whereas Coral's open spaces have more of a pasture feel, where they would graze their sheep, further adding to the sense of Coral being a more pragmatic and practical city. Coral is very consistent in how it uses materiality to symbolize the socioeconomic status of the various parts of town. Yeah, boards are an anachronism. But if boards were available in Coral, it would make sense where they have lots of trees in the area that would be a material that poor people would use for their houses. But Bethesda can't stop doing silly things. No one, no matter how poor, would patch a roof like that. First off, that uses way more wood than it would take to properly patch the roof. Second, that doesn't patch the roof. It makes the leak worse. That building's uninhabitable. Another detail that Coral gets right, it's subtle, but it's based upon how most cities are laid out around the world. Wealthy people live at the highest point in town, and the poor people live at the lowest point in town. Coral has a really nice little detail. At the Fighters Guild, there's this little bridge-like structure going over the road connecting two buildings. This is based upon lots of medieval examples, and it's built pretty much correctly. Post and beam structure, wattle and daub infill. My only major criticism, that bracing on the right should be mirrored on the left. This is where I'm going to end my critique of Coral. Overall, the city is pretty well designed, but to give Bethesda their due, when they decide to make a mistake, they stick with it, because we keep seeing the same mistakes over and over again. The most egregious repeated mistake, and it's the one I keep harping on, is the stables. Bethesda puts in the time and effort to successfully create cities that feel unique and distinct from each other. Yet, the player's first impression whenever they encounter the majority of these cities is sameness and repetition, right down to the same mistakes. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.